Hello and welcome to NewsClick. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is scheduled to visit India. His visit comes at a particularly troubling time. There are, of course, clouds of war over Iran. But another key area where US intervention has caused a lot of trouble is Latin America. To talk more about this, we have with us Professor Sonya Surabhi Gupta, Professor of Latin American Studies at Jamia Millia Islamia. Thank you for joining us. So could we first start with the larger perspective, so to speak? So we've seen a number of manifestations or implications of the US intervention in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Cuba, of course. So how do you see the current administration's larger strategical approach to the region, and what are the results?
Yes, I mean, Latin America, of course, it seemed that the pink tide had subsided and that, there was a complete change in the geopolitical landscape of Latin America. And it seemed that that it would be easy after, the big victories of the Latin American elites in Argentina and Brazil recently, that it would be a one-sided affair. But that's not how it has been. I mean, I think Latin America today is an arena of struggle where people are not ready to give away or cede away whatever have been their gains. And we can, of course, see that happening most clearly in Venezuela, but also in almost everywhere. There have been massive street protests. Brazil recently, as you know. Chile has had some 70,000 teachers, out on the streets. Argentina has constantly,
almost every week, exactly.
Or Argentina has been protesting, and this is election year for Argentina. October, they go to elections. But I think as far as the US is concerned, they have identified three countries, and that is Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, which they call the axis of evil. They've been able to, put friendly governments or help put friendly governments, for example, in Honduras, where they almost stole away the elections and gave it to this Juan Hernandez, who's, of course, now facing a massive uproar, street protests, military is out, and the US embassy the doors were set on fire. This happened, I think, even as we are speaking, things are really hotting up in Honduras. So basically what I'm trying to say is the entire Latin America today, there are street protests going on. There's a class struggle literally that is happening. And the bastion of the people's strength and people's revolution certainly is Venezuela. But Venezuela wouldn't exist without the presence of Cuba. And of course, the support from Bolivia and Nicaragua. So I think it is important to remember that almost in all countries of Latin America, there are these popular upsurges happening. And at the same time, we also find that the US is not letting up in any way. It would seem that its focus is now on Iran, etc. But that is just the present moment. There's a consistent effort from the United States, because not from now, of course, as we all know, that has happened historically. The fact that President Trump himself invoked in the UN General Assembly in September 2018, not too far back, the Monroe Doctrine, and the fact that the Monroe Doctrine has been mentioned again and again by his, the team, the Trump administration. Everyone knows that Monroe Doctrine kind of, when for Latin Americans, it brings very unpleasant memories, and it is a symbol of US intervention and US interventionism in Latin America since the time Latin American republics got their independence. And if the Monroe Doctrine dates back to 1823, that's how far back the Latin American interventions also date back. So that there has been a kind of a more aggressive posture of the United States towards Cuba. We know that during President Obama's time, there was a kind of softening up. There was a kind of admission of the US policy towards Cuba having failed. But all that seems to be past, and there is a there is a clear hardening of the US administration in terms of their intervention in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Cuba. Several reasons for it. Several reasons for it. One, of course, is the fact that 2020 is election year and all this is kind of, particularly what is happening towards Cuba. It would be very naive to say it's only happening because of the Florida vote, etc. But certainly that factor is also there. The other factor, of course, being that the United States seems to be using sanctions as an important element of their foreign policy. So it's not just Latin America, it's about 20 odd countries, which it is almost at war with. Because what are sanctions? Sanctions are proxy wars. So if you are at war with 20 odd countries and many of them are in Latin America, I mean, some of the main ones are in Latin America, I think it just goes on to say that Latin America continues to be considered by the United States administration as its backyard, which they don't want to give up on.
So to delve a bit more into Cuba, exactly. So like you said, the Obama administration went through a phase of trying to not normalize relations maybe, but at least reduce tensions to some extent. And that policy has seen a sharp turn ever since Trump came into power. So could you tell us a bit about what the details of what exactly these steps have been from the Trump administration side?
Well, the immediate thing that has happened just now is the fact that the Trump administration has decided to apply the Title III of the Helms-Burton law. I think we need to understand what's happening. This Helms-Burton law is a 1996 federal law. And the economic sanctions against Cuba is the most sanctioned country. So we were talking about sanctions. So sanctions, I think Cuba is, when I say it's the most sanctioned country, we also need to understand why. Why is it that a country which has not been at war with anybody, it has got the highest number of people going to school, it's got free education from all these achievements of the socialist state in Cuba, and you say, why is this country being singled out? Perhaps only because of this, or perhaps it is because of the Cuban model, that which the United States certainly wouldn't want to be replicated, and they have not hidden that fact. They have not been ambiguous about it. They have quite unashamedly said that the Cuban model is we don't want it replicated. So right now, I think the major flashpoint in Latin America, particularly in Cuba, is the invocation or the application or the Trump administration's decision to apply the Title III of the Helms-Burton law. I think we need to understand what this law is about. It was passed in 1996. It's got several titles. The whole idea was that in 1990s, just after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the United States was almost sure that Cuba is now going to crumble too, like the rest of the socialist camp. And it was here that a kind of a further tightening of the screw would do the job. So it is in that context that Cuba has, in the 90s was going through this, what is known as the special period, a period of huge economic distress for its people, for the state. And it is at that time, 96 precisely, that this act, or this act becomes a law, the Helms-Burton law. And the main idea of the law is to reinforce the economic sanctions. So the Title I is about strengthening the international sanctions against Cuba. The Title II is about bringing in a transition government, and then getting what they call full democracy. So this is Title II. So the Title III is a title which none of the presidents had till now applied. So, in this Helms-Burton law, every 6 months, the titles have to be, you have to review them. So none of the presidents, starting with the time it came during Bill Clinton's time, had invoked this. But the Obama administration in March this year decided to just extend the postponement for 45 days and have a comprehensive review. So since that time, the Cuban Foreign Ministry has been saying that this law is an extraterritorial law. It is completely against international institutions of justice and law. So what is this law? So as I have said, the Title 1, I have already told you, the Title 2, I have told you. The Title 3 goes back to Cuban history, to the moment of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, that is 1959, when along with the agrarian reform, the first law of the agrarian reform, several properties of Batista and his collaborators were actually confiscated by the revolutionary state. And also several other properties were nationalized. So what the US says is that, or has been saying, is that you have confiscated properties of US nationals. So the Title 3 is that that the US will not allow trafficking, they use the word trafficking, in the properties of US citizens. And US citizens can file lawsuits in the US on those properties. So this is ostensibly the defense of the US nationals, who were not even US nationals at that time, But the real fact is that, and they have said it, in 96, that they do not want international financial investment in Cuba. They're saying that, let them, die out of distress and so on and so forth. That was the idea. So now, when you apply the Title 3, you are also, so one part of the Title 3 is ban on travel to Cuba. So entire, whatever, as you are saying, not normalization, but some semblance of diplomacy, etc., which had happened during Obama's time. So right now, or even small ships, cruises, the cruise lines, even fishermen boats are all not going to be allowed, which means that there's a massive economic cost that the Cubans will have to pay, because the tourism, of course, is the mainstay of Cuban economy, and this kind of visits of the cruise liners and of private yachts and brings in so much, the hotel, the food, and everything. So, but it is also going to be so detrimental to U.S. Commercial interests. So there lies the hypocrisy that you are going to talk about a law of yours and apply it in a third country. But I think it's important to understand one more thing, that what the US called confiscation, Cuba says that there is a difference between confiscation and nationalization. Confiscation is a legal act, while nationalization is a state act. What do we mean by this? That the confiscation of properties happened only of those individuals who were found criminally implicated during the Batista dictatorship, Batista himself and his collaborators. So this is like in India, we would say that if there is a economic offense having been committed, say these Vijay Mallya, etc., so the court will attach their property. So that is confiscation. So that's what happened in Cuba. But the nationalization, which the revolutionary state took for the benefit of their people, it was on the basis of compensation.
Right.
So there was going to be government bonds spread over 20 years with a 4.5 annual interest accruing to it. So what I'm trying to say is that this law is bad in faith. So, and now the Title 3 is being invoked in order to create a situation where Cubans will face economic distress, will so much so that the same thing that they're trying to do in Venezuela, that create distress, create a crisis, and hope that there will be a rebellion.
Moving on to Venezuela, like you mentioned, this is the same strategy in a much more intense way that is being employed in Venezuela, with Guaido being brought in as a proxy. And fortunately, this strategy has not really worked, so despite them trying very hard. So what do you see as happening in Venezuela in the coming months? As in, how is the US likely to recalibrate its strategy, and what is the Venezuelan optimum response likely to be?
You see, the US underestimates the sense of dignity people have. Right. You see, so for example, the Cuban minister, had said that if the US invokes the Title 3, then the Cubans, every house that they have, the schools where their children study, the polyclinic where they get the medical, all of it is properties which were nationalized by the government. And so the people have invested something in the Cuban Revolution. It's not the state's revolution, it's the Cuban people's revolution. Now, this is something which the US doesn't seem to be able to understand. And I think in Venezuela, they tried again to do this. same thing, that create a crisis, say there's a humanitarian crisis, but what is the crisis? The crisis is that you're putting sanctions. You are not allowing medicines to come. You are not allowing foodstuff to come. You will allow foodstuff to come only through the Colombian border. Now, that is the hypocrisy. So then this February 23rd or whenever, it was sometime in February this year, when they wanted to bring these huge trucks laden with food into Venezuela. Yeah, and well, it didn't work out because the Red Cross, etc., said that there is no humanitarian crisis. Of course, the Venezuelan people are going through a very, very difficult time. I mean, I was there about a year and a half back, so I don't know about the recent. I mean, I haven't seen with my eyes, but from what one reads, things haven't become any better, despite efforts from the government, through the CLAP to distribute food, etc. But it is. There is no humanitarian crisis there, I mean, they've still defeated them in football recently, the US team, So, I mean, life is normal within course. There is university, there is dance, there's music, and, there's life. So, outside one would think that, there is a...
It's a war-like zone.
Yeah.
It's a war zone, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
So people, I think, if anyone have had any doubts about the Bolivarian revolution, I think it has become clear now, this year, that when Guaido was foisted upon this thing, they even tried to have defections from the army, but the people came out on the streets. I mean, those were amazing scenes, People just came out around Miraflores, the palace, and in defense of their legitimately elected president. So I think the US at the moment has given up on Guaido because he was not able to mobilize. And also you see all these media wars there, CNN versus Fox, and, So, and now, of course, the new corruption charges that have surfaced against Guaido's own camp, and the opposition is not happy with that at all. What has happened to all the money that the US poured in, not just the aid, all the money of the Citgo, which was given to Guaido, I mean, to the opposition, the self-proclaimed president, who was recognized by so many countries, who must be now thinking, what's happened to our president, whom we recognized. Imagine Brazil recognizing somebody like him, and now what do they do with him? Because the US has dumped him, literally. So now there are talks going on. There's negotiation going on in Norway, which is what the Maduro government has always been saying. Not only Maduro government, I mean, even people from outside, for example, President Zapatero, and also Mexico, of course, Uruguay, Mexico, etc. And President Zapatero from Spain, ex-president. All these people who have been involved in negotiations have been saying, come sit across the table, but that's something which the US was just not ready to do it. Otherwise, it would happen last May, just before the elections. So this, I mean, I don't see much coming out of the negotiations, but we have to pin all our hopes on the negotiations that have started. It's a very welcome move, and that's the only way forward, that both the parties sit, because we cannot have this situation. This will otherwise go on endlessly, because I don't see the people, Venezuelan people, losing heart, or it's too strong. What they've got, they cannot give away, because they've got something. So it's an interesting situation right now. Also, some of these elections, see in Mexico, the change of government has changed a little bit. Even the Lima group is not as active.
Cohesive as before.
Yeah,
right.
So I think we'll also have to wait for the Argentinian elections to see. Guatemala, of course, is also, it's a small country, but
and Bolivia for that.
And Bolivia, of course, yes, Bolivia is. So we have to wait and see what will happen politically, and but I really do think that when the US puts Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua as the rogue states, it's because they've realized that there is something deep happening there in terms of the social change. Otherwise they would just be happy with the, of course they have tried coups. They've tried coups of all sorts, even till very recently. But I mean, in Ecuador, in Venezuela, even now, the idea that you can divide the army and, so I think it is important to understand that Venezuela is going through a very, very difficult times, but the Venezuelan people are not giving up. And overall, I think Cuban people are not giving up either. So we will have a cowboy president, in an election year, trying to have this very aggressive stance. And, such a lot of distress for so many people in the continent.
Thank you so much for talking to us. That's all we have time for today. Keep watching NewsClick.